Hi, and welcome to the Independent Women's Forum's Center for Economic Opportunity. This is our home for economic, tech, and labor policy. My name is Patrice Onwuka, and I'm the director of the Center for Economic Opportunity. And it is my pleasure to kick off today's discussion. This is the third in our series of discussions with a particular focus on women. So far, the response from you guys has been fantastic. So please, in advance, like this video, follow us at iwf.org/CEO, and don't forget to sign up for our monthly newsletter, The Pointer, which captures all of our analysis and commentary on these tech, labor, and economic issues. So, this is the busy holiday season. We are less than 2 weeks from Christmas, and it is hugely important to women, both as consumers and as small business owners. That's why it's important that we take some time to understand how free market competition helps small business owners and shoppers alike, but also to question the legislative efforts floating around Congress right now that aim to address that, or maybe purport to address that. Here to moderate this discussion with some fantastic experts is my colleague, Carrie Sheffield. She has been writing about antitrust issues with me for some time now, and I know you're going to enjoy this discussion with Carrie just as much as I will. So, Carrie, thanks for moderating today's panel discussion.
Thank you, Patrice, and thank you so much for your leadership here at our Center for Economic Opportunity. We believe that economic opportunity is pretty much one of the strongest things you need to build your American dream, and so we are all about building that dream here. So we're going to talk today about antitrust and me. Does competition need more protections? And we have two wonderful policy experts on the tech piece, because as they say, every company, no matter what it is going to be so infused with tech that it's, whether it's a pizza company, it's a tech company, because it's so reliant on tech. That's really where we are as an economy today, and where we're going to be even more in the future. So that's why we brought in two tech policy experts here today. So I will bring them here onto the stage, and we'll hear their remarks to basically get a lay of the land and get their thoughts on competition, technology, and the future. So first, I'll introduce them both just quickly, and then we'll go to Jennifer first. So we've got Jennifer Huddleston. She is the policy counsel at NetChoice, and she'll explain a bit more about what NetChoice is and her role there. And then we've also got Katie McAuliffe. She's executive director of the Digital Liberty Center at Americans for Tax Reform, which is the brainchild of the fabulous Grover Norquist, who I've known for a very long time. We all know and love Grover. Also, fabulous name too. All right, so let's kick it off. Jennifer, the floor is open to you. What do you see on the landscape for competition and antitrust, and why should we care? Why should women at home watching this program, and men, why does it matter?
Thanks, and thank you so much to IWF for having us today to talk about this really important topic that, as you mentioned, I think is very important to all consumers. NetChoice is a trade association dedicated to free expression and free enterprise online. Our members include big tech companies, but they also include a lot of smaller tech companies. When we're talking about antitrust, we've really been talking about it a lot in the tech space recently. But I think it's important to take a step back and look at how much broader competition policy is. While there's a lot of debates about big tech or tech in general these days, whatever happens with this debate over antitrust and competition policy is going to impact a lot more than just the tech sector. We are already hearing Democrats such as Amy Klobuchar and David Cicilline talk about the impact that this could have in other industries as well, and not just thinking about those ways that data impacts those industries, but about the way they could potentially use this tool to go after other industries and engage in regulations and breakups in those as well. But looking at this most recent package of legislation that we've seen, there are two different packages, one in the House of Representatives that has several bills, and then we've also started to see a couple of bills on the Senate side too, looking to change the way that antitrust law in the US would currently operate. When we're talking about these latest proposals, one thing to really think about is not just what does this mean for big tech companies, but what does this mean for how we view antitrust? Right now, antitrust is focused on the consumer welfare standards. This has been great for companies of all sizes, as well as for consumers, because rather than presuming that big is bad the way that was presumed in earlier eras of antitrust, or allowing antitrust to be politicized for various uses, the focus has really been on, are consumers being harmed by the behavior? And if not, if consumers are benefiting from the current system, we don't necessarily say just because a company is large that its actions are automatically harmful. And this has allowed a wide range of actions to happen that actually benefit consumers. And it means that these markets are diverse and that oftentimes we need to take a step back and look more at what all of our choices are. So if we think about, as you mentioned, it's the holiday season, a lot of us are doing our Christmas shopping. There's a lot of different ways we may do that. So yes, you may choose Amazon because you find what's best for you is having that same day delivery you can get in cities, or 2-day delivery, or you trust Prime. But you also may be using Amazon to find small sellers on the marketplace that you wouldn't have found otherwise. You may then be mixing that with other retail sources. As a recent NetChoice report talked about, retail is everywhere now. So you have brick and mortar stores, you have in-person options, and you also have online options. And for small businesses, this has really allowed them to diversify how they reach consumers and allowed us as consumers to have access to more choices than ever before. We can certainly get into the weeds of how else we've seen these markets diversify and grow in our lifetimes, whether you're someone who is running their own company and now has an easier time of reaching consumers all over the world, or lower advertising costs, or if you're a consumer who's able to have more choices in how you communicate with your family over this holiday season.
Great. Well, Jennifer, thank you for that rundown. I have lots of questions about what you just said, but we'll get to that in a minute. Katie, why don't you introduce yourself, what you do there at Americans for Tax Reform, and give your broad sense of the lay of the land right now for competition and antitrust.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to talk about this topic because it really affects everything that's going on in the industry right now. I'm executive director of Digital Liberty. It's a sister organization of Americans for Tax Reform. So I work primarily on tech and telecom policy issues and have been doing so for a long time. One of the things that Jennifer mentioned was the consumer welfare standard, and you might hear about this a lot in news reporting. It's really hard to talk about competition policy or antitrust in the US without talking about the consumer welfare standard and the idea that customers are better off. And when we look at the way the world is now versus the way it was before, and as we use more technology and we have other options, are consumers better off? One of those is the advertising markets. I mean, it's a lot easier for small businesses to get to their customers when you have digital options. Advertising is much cheaper on, say, Facebook or through Google, advertising via search on Amazon, advertising via search on Apple. A lot of these other things are much more cost effective for small businesses. And you look at innovations like Amazon Prime. These are competitive elements that get other businesses to do better. And we've seen a lot of improvements in shipping. We've seen improvements in same-day services. And those are really important things for small businesses to succeed as well. Particularly after the pandemic, Americans are way more aware of how technology has made our lives better. In fact, in one survey, 9 out of 10 Americans expressed that they had a better appreciation for technology. So what's going on? Why, when the technology sector is so popular and Congress is so unpopular, would we be going after these companies? And it's really about political preferences. Antitrust law for a long time has done a really good job at only looking at consumer welfare, and that keeps a lot of politics out of it. The main enforcement agency is the Federal Trade Commission. Now, what's going on there is they're doing a lot of changing of how things work that have been going on for a long time and consolidating power in the chair, which even if some of this legislation doesn't pass in Congress, we might see much more aggressive moves coming from the Federal Trade Commission that would limit our accesses to things like cheaper advertising, Amazon Prime, like Jennifer was mentioning, in search. So these are really important things to look at. I mean, it's very unclear, When you look at a traditional economic post analysis, consumers continue to receive better services for either free or lower prices. So this is something we really need to think about. Meanwhile, at the FTC, they've removed a lot of protections. There's no longer an independent prosecutor to oversee whether they're going to undertake an investigation. Basically, one commissioner can push that forward. They are relooking at their unfair methods of competition. And when we talk about unfair methods of competition, rulemaking and policies, that's really where bureaucrats and elected officials can push their political policy preferences in there rather than looking at what's best for everyday Americans.
Great, thank you, Katie. So you both of you hit on this concept of the consumer welfare standard. Can we unpack that a little bit? Jennifer, why don't you give the legal history of what that term actually means and why it's so important? Kind of define it a little bit for us.
So antitrust actually goes back to the turn of the 20th century when the concerns were not about big tech companies, but about quote unquote trust in industries like railroads and steel. And you were hearing a lot of calls of concern about what to do with these large companies. And a series of laws were passed to provide legal structure that would help ensure competition in various industries. At the start, though, it wasn't necessarily clear how courts should distinguish between behavior that resulted in a large share of an industry that was still competitive and that truly anti-competitive behavior that was out there that may not have necessarily been covered by one of the per se violations of these laws. So there are certain actions that these laws make clear are considered violations and anti-competitive, but there's a lot of other behaviors that it kind of leaves open to interpretation based perhaps on the impact that they had. So for many years under these laws, there was a lot of room for interpretation by the courts, and not really a set standard. So you could see companies either survive antitrust challenges because they were favored companies or go down for behavior that might have been otherwise allowable because they couldn't prove that they were not, that they didn't have an objective standard by which to be measured by. The consumer welfare standard was developed by Judge Bork and some other law and economics scholars out of the University of Chicago, really emphasized the idea of having that objective standard focused on consumer welfare as a way to identify whether or not behavior would be considered harmfully anti-competitive. Now, the advantage of having an objective standard like this is that it enables large businesses to have a better idea of how their behavior will be measured. It allows small businesses to have a better idea of how certain actions by large companies will be measured. And most importantly, it keeps the focus on the consumers. It focuses on those who really are going to experience the most benefits from the market. Now, there's been a lot of conversation around what the consumer welfare standard does and does not do. And some critics try to make it out to be a very one-dimensional standard that doesn't take into account things like innovation. But the truth of the matter is that the consumer welfare standard is there to be an objective standard and is a tool, though, that is more than just the pure economic price as well. But it keeps some of these policy concerns that could allow antitrust to be politicized and go back to that earlier era out of it while still really focusing on the consumers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, Katie, and I want to get your thoughts after Jennifer. So if that's great history, but is there a difference in your mind between a physical product? So let's say Amazon is selling, an example I've given is generic batteries or generic toilet paper or paper towel. So Amazon has its own brands called Amazon Basic or Presto, things like that. And if you look at a generic battery pack, the same number of batteries, the same size from the Amazon generic, and then compare it to Energizer or Duracell or one of the brand name ones, Amazon is considerably cheaper. So from the consumer standpoint, that would be a win for the consumer. But do you think there's a difference between a hard product like that versus the marketplace of ideas when it comes specifically to political ideas and access to the consumer, i.e. the voter? Because a lot of conservatives, including Senator Josh Hawley, and he's gotten some other folks on board with him, Chuck Grassley is looking at this, to say there is a monopoly of ideas because these tech companies are so liberal leaning that you have, the Democrats, receive donations by far compared to Republicans from these tech employees and executives. When you look at the funding, I say this as a former entrepreneur who had a digital TV network. I would see these news outlets that were getting money from a place like Facebook, millions of dollars would go to very liberal programs, and only a few of those contracts would go to conservative news programs. And I found that very frustrating as a conservative media entrepreneur. So do you think that there is some truth to say, okay, the consumer is actually being harmed when we're talking about the marketplace of ideas? Katie, we'll go to you first, then Jennifer, I'd like to hear your thoughts too.
So on the marketplace of ideas, I think, I kind of go back to like AM radio and how conservative voice just dominates AM radio. I mean, that's what people want to listen to. They go to that platform and they hear that. And I think while a lot of the points that you made are incredibly valid and frustrating, when it comes to antitrust and competition, it's more on the business side and what consumers are getting in that space. But when we also look at the marketplace of ideas, there's so many more opportunities for us to get our voices out there. So, I mean, consistently on Facebook, the top performing links are from, conservative thought leaders. And, some of my favorite podcasts, it's so much easier to find a lot of this information when I look at podcasting, or which I kind of see as the new radio. I'm a huge fan of radio personally. I used to work in radio. And so I love that medium for folks to be able to get the news and the information that they want. So while a lot of those things are frustrating, I think we have a lot of opportunities to get our voices out there. I mean, right now we are using Facebook, Twitter, all the various things to share this message. And I think that's really important. And I'm not sure that some of the ideas around breaking up companies, I'm not sure that would actually increase diversity of thought or diversity of access to those platforms. You might have more interesting people take over who perhaps say we can't have memes on their platform anymore. So this is, we see some of this evolution. So the devil is really in the details.
Yeah, and if I could just kind of add on to what Katie said, I think oftentimes when we're talking about antitrust, particularly in the context of big tech these days, all these different concerns kind of get mixed together. So we start talking about a lot of policy issues that are not going to be best addressed by antitrust. Antitrust is a sledgehammer when oftentimes, if we're looking at a much more specific policy issue, what you really need is a scalpel. There certainly are debates that are going on a lot of these other issues, whether it's content moderation, data privacy, what various other elements when it comes to the future of technology. But antitrust really is best served when it is focused on its intended purpose of discussing that competition related policy in the market. So to build off of something Katie said, if we look at this idea of what would happen if you broke up tech companies over something like concerns about content moderation when it comes to the number of conservative voices, there really is a question of, would you see the impacts that you wanted, even if you use that tool successfully? So a separate Instagram and a separate Facebook, there's no guarantee you're going to get different content moderation standards there. And if anything, you may have more difficulty at time as these companies would have fewer resources, fewer content moderators to engage in the type of moderation that we want them to engage in on these issues. I also think it's important to point out, as Katie was kind of saying, that one of the advantages is if we take a step back and look at this market more as a whole, the number of different places we have to get voices and ideas out has grown exponentially. Not only are we seeing an increasing number of new platforms emerge, where if we're having this conversation in another decade, I'm guessing we would be possibly on a different platform than we are now. And if we'd had it a decade previously, and the technology had been here, the type of platforms we would think where our audience are would be entirely different as well. But particularly for, say, conservative young women that want to get their voice out there, you have more opportunities than ever before because of this diverse array of platforms. You no longer have to go to a newspaper editor and convince them to take your op-ed. You can create a blog, you can create a Twitter account, you can create a Rumble account, you can create a Facebook account, you can have all these different mediums to potentially go and reach your audience in a way that in a more analog era really put up a lot of barriers.
Well, that's what's so interesting. And both of you kind of touched on this idea of content moderation. So that brings me to a very hairy topic. And we're gonna talk about Section 230. But first, I just want our audience to understand, why is Section 230 important? And then both of you give your perspective on whether you think that tech companies should continue to receive protections under Section 230. That's something certainly that former President Trump said no. From his perspective, no. And a lot of conservative voices have said, no, these tech companies are trying to have it both ways. They want to have their cake and eat it too under Section 230, but it's actually, they do not deserve these protections anymore. Walk us through, Katie, what is Section 230 and what's your read on it?
Sure. So Jennifer can probably give you some more of the details of the history of Section 230, the Communications Act, Communications Decency Act. But Section 230 kind of has a set around moderation where, just very basic, if someone posts something on your website, you're not liable for what they say. Which is really important if you want to be able to leave honest reviews. A lot of us use Yelp or TripAdvisor, and we want honest reviews of whatever's going on. It's also how we're able to post comments and things on Facebook, product reviews on Amazon or Etsy or any of these places. So the reviews are very important, and that's one of the major things that it protects. It also allows platforms to moderate their content, and it gives them the space to take down things that they find objectionable. So you can keep certain things off of your platform, terms of service. A lot of platforms don't want to be full of porn. And so I think that's a good thing. Other ones do, and that's a good thing. But with Section 230, a lot of the discussion is very separate from antitrust, because we're dealing with a speech issue. And in a number of the court cases, it's come down on rulings of how these different types of moderation can take place. And I think, really, if we want changes in Section 230, we need to work with Congress and look at how those specifically might happen. I haven't seen anything yet that I'm a huge fan of for actually changing it that I think would make things better. There's also the avenue of the courts. We look at some of the things that take away Section 230 protections. That does include editing or suggesting how users should make their post, or what happens when you go follow a link. So there may be a case there if someone wanted to pursue that, but I'll kick it over to Jennifer for some more details on it.
Yeah, and Jennifer, if you could specifically talk about tech companies versus news companies, because again, I come from a news background, and a lot of journalists are really angry at the tech companies because they say the tech companies are trying to pretend they're not content companies, but they behave like them in so many ways. They have fact checkers, they slap labels on things, they suppress the ability to basically circulate certain ideas. So do you agree with that idea that they are in many ways these tech companies are actually more like a news organization or a content company, and thus should have the same regulations, because the news organizations don't enjoy a lot of the broad, unfettered, liability protections that the tech companies do?
Well, I will briefly answer a bit of Carrie's question, and then I'm going to kind of change topics a little bit, because I do think content moderation and antitrust are two separate issues, and I want to make sure we focus on antitrust. I will point out NetChoice is the plaintiff, or is one of the plaintiffs in a lawsuit involving the Texas content moderation law. As part of the preliminary injunction there in the judge's decision, he mentions the First Amendment rights of tech companies to engage in content moderation. So I think it's important when we're talking about content moderation that we remember, particularly as conservatives, that this isn't just about Section 230, which has become a bit of a lightning rod of things, but this is also about First Amendment rights of private companies. And that's something that I think a lot of conservatives care very deeply about, the First Amendment speech rights of private companies. With that being said, I think the reason that these two conversations sometimes do get brought up together is there's an interesting element here where some of what helps encourage competition online is the fact that there are that the ability to carry user-generated content has become a way to get more ideas out there. And because smaller platforms, things like review sites, Yelp and TripAdvisor, things like Wikipedia, that's actually a nonprofit, someone who wants to create a new conservative social media network, can do so and carry user-generated content without the fear, or without their investors' fear, that one wrong action could result in company-ending liability. So one thing to think about when we're talking about some of these proposed content moderation changes is not what impact would they just have on the user experience on these large guys, but also what impact would they have on the ability of small platforms to get into the market, to challenge in the market, so that we can see continued competition and growth and diversity. That's also why it is so important that when we're looking at antitrust, that we stay focused on that consumer welfare standard, and that we don't accidentally run into this problem where a lot of other policy issues get mixed in that really are better discussed elsewhere and have antitrust used as a tool. Because even if it's a policy program that, or a policy issue that you may personally very much believe in, opening up antitrust to those kind of conversations is going to allow the other side to do the same thing. It's going to allow them to put their own preferences when it comes to their personal policy issues that they believe need to be considered, whether it's, workers' rights or green issues or whatever, to also be part of that consumer welfare standard. So we really want to stay focused on the objective nature of antitrust, lest it become a tool that can be used for various political purposes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think the reason why people bring up content moderation in a conversation about antitrust is because there's this chart that I remember seeing about Google ad revenue and how it shot up, and newspaper advertising revenue spiked down. So it's this almost perfect, just basically gobbling up of the news industry revenues. And you had hundreds and thousands of newspapers, small newspapers, who had digital ad revenue or print revenue, but it was all getting gobbled up by one big player. And so that's why there are concerns about monopolistic practice, because Google is basically the big gorilla that's taking all the ad revenue. Meanwhile, they don't pay for the content from the news business. So I think that's part of the concern in terms of whether there's an unfair thumb on the scale for places like Google because they are shielded by Section 230, but a news organization is not. So I think there's certainly very relevant questions there. But I want to move to some audience questions. We have one here on Twitter. I asked people on Twitter, should we break up big tech or would that raise prices for consumers? And I got a response here from @ClipGod1. And he says, he's progressive. He likes to troll me sometimes. And he says, or you could just start your own tech hubs and stop complaining. That's called capitalism if you lazy conservatives haven't figured it out yet. So when it comes to competition, I'm seeing platforms like Getter, which is a competitor to Twitter, and they've just taken off in the past year. Jason Miller, Trump's former spokesman, is the CEO over there. And then you have former President Trump. He's launched his own technology company, and he's raising a lot of money for that. You have other sites like Rumble, which is a competitor to YouTube. What do you ladies think about this question? Do you agree with what he's saying in terms of conservatives should stop complaining about this and just get out there and compete? Katie, I'll start with you.
It's always good to compete, but it doesn't mean that we should ignore some of the issues that are going on. It's always good to get out there and be able to build a better mousetrap. And that's actually what Jennifer and I are both talking about, being able to protect that mechanism to be able to do that. I mean, we're looking at legislation that would get rid of things and would actually change the way companies work right now. Legislation that would get rid of generic label products, like you were talking about. These are things that we use, and it's just online. It wouldn't have anything to do with, I mean, I would hate to see Kirkland brand products from Costco go away. I think everybody loves those. I think we can all relate. I think we can all relate to generic products at CVS or my favorite labels at Target. These are the kind of things that we use every day. And there are services that, because of this growth in technology, that are now free to consumers. So encrypted messaging, video conferencing, those are things that are all available free to consumers now that were not available free before. So yes, we can continue to compete on the merits, but these are things that we still need to discuss, and we need to make sure that we don't have legislation that goes through that emphasizes political priorities and just goes after companies that we're mad at. Either side can take advantage of that. But really looking at the consumer welfare standard and what's good for consumers and what's positive there. I mean, Jennifer's mentioned, losing maps from the search where we would be able to find small local businesses. These things are important. Jennifer, I saw you unmuted for a second there. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in. I think it's also important to remember how often new entrants and innovation in general has been our best competition policy. You look back at some of the decisions that were made, such as blocking the Hollywood Video Blockbuster merger at a time when Netflix was just emerging. And in hindsight, that seems so unbelievable, because we think, we can kind of wonder what might have been, how our home entertainment landscape might have changed. But in the view of regulators at that time, they were looking very myopically at just what was going on in home entertainment then, which to them meant video rentals. But
today, some of these new legislations, Jennifer, they're saying that they're going to define the market, and companies are going to be presumed guilty, and they're not going to be able to come back and say, actually, this is what the market looks like. And that kind of thing is really problematic when we want to say, what is the market for video conferencing? We want to talk about that. What's the market for entertainment? I mean, you reminded me of how long the Sirius XM merger was put off.
Right.
When bringing those two companies together, it wasn't the satellite market, it was the audio market.
And you mentioned the reason I unmuted when you said video conferencing is you think about how even just 2 years ago, this would have been seen as a very kind of infant industry that very few people used on a regular basis. And now, to say you Zoom someone is basically like saying you grab an Uber. It can mean so many different things. And that if we only look at the situation with the eyes that we have now and with the way things look now, we may miss a bigger change. So if we're only looking for the next Facebook or the next Google in terms of looking for an exact duplicate copycat, we may miss a broader shift that's coming, the way that 20 or so years ago, we didn't necessarily see the change from a video rental store to DVDs in the mail to streaming entertainment.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting that when you stifle competition, you don't even know what you're stifling. So we got another question here from a viewer. They want to know, so we've been talking about this consumer standard, but so if we did away with the consumer standard or consumer harm standard, what standard do lawmakers want to adopt? What standard would they want to replace consumer harm with? And will companies really stop their services if these bills pass? Jennifer, I'll go to you first.
So in many ways, these bills would shift back to a presumption that big is bad, that companies that reach a certain size as defined by these bills would therefore have various additional requirements placed on them just by the nature of their size that would really change the way they're able to engage in the marketplace, particularly.
And so size, are you saying that lawmakers basically want to have a revenue threshold or a number of users threshold?
Right. So it varies from the bill to bill, what exactly that that definition is. It also varies, interestingly, about whether it is a static definition in terms of the companies when this bill is enacted would be subject to it, or if it's a definition that allows more companies as they grow. Because while in many cases the companies that would be subject to these bills requirement right now are all tech companies, when you look at companies like Walmart or Visa, they're very close to those thresholds sometimes. And with the way these definitions are, there's a real possibility that it could expand beyond just the tech sector. Some of the things that we would see with regards to what that means in terms of there would be a presumption that big is bad is that it would change the conversation around acquisitions, around the ability to, as Katie was mentioning, to list certain products that are store brands, or to prioritize those products in any way. So if you go to Target, Target can put the Target brand on the end cap, but Amazon under these bills wouldn't necessarily be allowed to say, and here's our version of the Duracell batteries if you're interested. Target can do that physically in their stores under these bills, but if it's online, Amazon likely wouldn't be able to do that. Similarly, a lot of conversations have to do with Amazon Prime, and I think that's because it's something that a lot of us can really understand. And so could you offer, under some of these bills, you wouldn't be able to necessarily offer Prime Video for free with Amazon Prime. It would have to be a separate kind of service. You wouldn't necessarily you'd be able to designate items as, you wouldn't necessarily be able to designate which items are Prime eligible, because that would be seen as kind of preferencing those items rather than having a truly equal playing field. And the problem there is, I think a lot of us can see how that would have a somewhat negative impact on our enjoyment of this service. But again, thinking about small businesses, a lot of those quote unquote Prime designated items are a way for them to get more attention, to get more consumers to their products in a way that allows them to have a greater reach than they might have. And so we'd really not only be seeing a harm to consumers in this case, but also a lot of questions around the ability of smaller businesses to use these services that have helped them grow at lower cost.
Well, when shipping goes up to more than next day, I mean, that's really going to change things for small businesses. And yes, companies will change their practices. We don't know how they would change their practices, because that's speculation, and I'm not going to go there. But I mean, you can see a world where Amazon no longer has third-party sellers, and I think that would be pretty awful if they're told that they can't have other people there to compete. This has been and having Amazon Prime, I mean, we're talking not just about Prime designated items, but we're also talking about the shipping that allows those items to get there.
And I think there are some other things we can talk about as well outside of the Amazon context that we could certainly imagine. There's been a lot of conversations around app stores, for example, and how some of these proposals could impact the security and privacy in app stores, how they could impact things. For example, a lot of the debate over third-party payment processors and how that could impact setting parental controls on the amount that your child's allowed to spend on a game through their iTunes account or whatnot. If there's a third-party payment processor, that then becomes a lot harder to do. So I think that, this is much bigger than just, it's easy for a lot of consumers to understand how it would impact Amazon and Prime, but this is certainly a much bigger issue than just an Amazon issue.
Sure. Well, and to both of you have both kind of shared the perspective, and I, correct me if I'm summarizing wrong, that, making sure that the consumer harm standard is maintained. But what about, again, so many conservatives feel that they aren't even, allowed to access some of these platforms, whether it's, PayPal or some banks or credit card companies or hosting companies, targeting conservative or right-leaning, just ability to run their business or to create a business, to our conversation about competition. How can conservatives, if they see the deck is so stacked against them, how is that in any way practically, beyond just the theoretical about embracing competition, would we ever actually see an actual competitor to these very big companies if just by de facto, they can't even get the tools to compete? Katie.
Yeah, so there's a lot packed in there. I mean, when we're looking at speech and how to get out and how to compete, we have a lot of tools, and there are instances where we really worry about our access. But one of the things I would point out is really looking at what the Biden administration is doing and who their nominees are for different positions and those sorts of things. There were 28 senators that opposed Lena Khan's appointment to the FTC. We've seen a lot of these very European style politics over consumer welfare. And I think conservatives really get harmed when we move away from consumer welfare, which is an objective standard, and we start moving more towards this idea of dominance or anything along those lines. It becomes much more political and swings back and forth. But we need to look at nominees, and another one coming down is the nomination to the FCC by Gigi Sohn. And we really need to pay attention to that, because that really is First Amendment rights. She's had some disturbing tweets talking about, how Fox News is a danger to democracy, and perhaps Sinclair shouldn't have the licenses that they have. These are things that we really need to worry about when we look at the nominees who the Biden administration puts up. And when the Biden administration puts out an executive order on competition that says they want something like net neutrality, and net neutrality doesn't just mean no blocking, no throttling, and all these nice things on the internet that don't actually happen outside of how to best provide service for you. I mean, they want to use that to get rid of things like zero rating for your programs. They want to use that for rate regulation on broadband. And these are other things that can really get in the way, seriously get in the way of First Amendment rights.
Mm-hmm. Well, we just have Jennifer.
Yes, I think something else to certainly watch is how much power these bills give to the FTC, and given the current philosophical standing of the chair particularly, but of the FTC as a whole, what are those sort of things that this increased power, if it shifts away from an objective consumer welfare standard, is going to allow the agency to incorporate into the antitrust standard? It's going to be things like, is this company green enough? It's going to be things around various other social justice leaning issues. I don't think that, what we're seeing right now, I just would really caution conservatives to think about what the actual results would be of handing over this increased power without that objective check to that agency.
Well, and some of the bills even include like a 10-member board at the FTC if a company goes over a threshold, and that 10-member board can make decisions about how the company wants to innovate or grow or anything along those lines. And that would be a very closed, almost, I would think, very un-American way of regulating businesses.
It all sounds very Orwellian, the death panel of your business. So we got to wrap up here real quick. How can our audience and the women watching this program, how can we learn more about what you do? And then what sort of call to action would you give for our audience who cares about these issues? What can we do from home or from our own small business or whatever we're doing to engage in these issues? Katie, we'll start with you.
Sure. So I am Digital Liberty. You can find me at Digital Liberty on Twitter if you're interested in following or hearing more about these issues. And definitely get active, reach out to your congressman, reach out to your senator. It's actually very easy to get in touch with them and let your opinions be known. Give them a phone call, shoot them an email. These are kind of things that are really important, and they need to hear from you. They need to hear that you care about these products, because these things are happening. You care about the access to services. These things are happening really very slowly and under our nose. I tend to think that legislation takes about 10 years to get passed or anything to happen, but this seems to be moving very quickly, and without the kind of attention that that folks need to pay to it, some things might end up in legislation and in law that we really don't agree with as we, act out our day.
And I am also on Twitter at JRHuddles, and you can check out NetChoice's website, netchoice.org, which has a lot of my writing as well as many of our other councils writing on various issues, including the ones we discussed today. In terms of what I think women should consider doing, I think a lot of this is also really holding policymakers accountable around these conversations. So if policymakers say this isn't going to break prime or this isn't going to impact small businesses, really asking the hard questions, looking at the details like we discussed today of, not letting them just say these things without actually looking at the impact it would have, particularly for so many women that have had such a real opportunity arise online.
Sorry, you're muted, Carrie.
I'm so sorry. Thank you, ladies. Yay tech. So I just want to thank both of you. You brought up very important points about these laws and these policies and these decisions from the bureaucrats and from the swamp here. That so many of these programs, as Ronald Reagan said, that the closest thing to eternal life is a government program. So it might take 10 years to pass it through, but then it might take 50 years to get it repealed or to get it reformed. And so the engagement on the front end is so important. We're here on our 501c3 side at IWF. We've also got a 501c4, which is Independent Women's Voice, where we do advocacy work and specifically talk about legislation and nominees as well. So ladies, we appreciate you both highlighting such important issues and all you're doing to protect liberty and competition and innovation. And thank you for your insights today on antitrust issues, and make sure everyone to follow them both. And ladies, we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
And thank you all. And thank you, Patrice Onwuka. She's our director here at the top of the show. You all met her. She is passionate about making sure that innovation and competition are preserved here in our country, because we are a country like no other in what we've built here. I love speaking to immigrants from other countries, and Patrice's family is an immigrant family, and they cherish what we have here. And so it's so important to preserve that. So we want to thank you all for joining us here today. For more information, as here on our website, go to iwf.org/CEO and sign up for our newsletter. We will catch you in the next episode. Thank you.